Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Great Old Ones Gaming. I am your host, Nate, and today I'm joined with my fellow co-host, the Man from Leng. How are you, Man from Leng?
I'm good, thank you.
And with us today is a very special guest. We have the creative director for the Call of Cthulhu RPG at Chaosium, Mike Mason. Mike, welcome to the show.
Oh, hi. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure. For those in the audience who may not know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself and your initial brushings with the mythos.
Oh, okay. Well, as you said, I'm the creative director at Chaosium for the Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, which basically means I do a number of things. I manage the line, I look after it. I guess I'm kind of the lead writer, but I also co-write and so forth. I'm the line editor and art director and so forth. So I kind of, even if I don't write the whole book, I work on pretty much every book in the Cthulhu line to make sure it kind of fits the Chaosium style and does what it needs to do and says what it needs to say, and then work with artists to make it pretty and look fantastic and kind of get it out there. I co-wrote the latest edition of the game, the 7th edition rules, with my friend Paul Fricker some years ago now. And, 7th edition came out and has kind of revitalized the game somewhat and has brought in a whole boatload of new players into the game and people that played it before many years ago and have returned to the game since. Because the game is, we just passed our 40th anniversary for the game. So it's an old game now in that sense, but it's still got plenty of blood inside it and is chugging along. And I've been working for Chaosium for nearly 10 years, I guess, working on Call of Cthulhu. Prior to that, in between doing jobs in the real world, I also worked at Games Workshop, and my kind of final role at Games Workshop was working as the Black Industries manager, which was their tabletop role-playing and board games division. So while I was there, I was kind of looking after Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Talisman, the board game. But probably the most significant thing I did while I was doing that was co-author the 40K role-playing game Dark Heresy, which then spawned various kind of iterations like Rogue Trader and so on. And I've kind of been, around the peripheries of the gaming industry for a little while, doing freelance work and so forth. But I kind of washed upon the shore of Chaosium and have been there ever since.
Seems like your tendrils are all through the Call of Cthulhu line nowadays.
It does seem to be that way.
I also heard, I can't remember if it was the Good Friends of Jackson Elias or in a recent episode of the Modern Mythos that you had done with Seth and John. But I also heard that you were a bit of an actor as well in your early days.
Oh, crikey. Yeah. That's I actually did theatre and drama at university. I have a kind of degree in drama and directing and acting and that kind of thing. But back in the day, I used to do a bit of acting work here and there. I did extra work on some feature films, and for many years I was with a group of murder mystery group. So we would do kind of murder mystery kind of audience participation kind of events, and I always ended up being the murderer. I don't know why.
Well, it seems like your career in acting melds very well with what you do now, Mike. But as you said, the Call of Cthulhu RPG recently celebrated its 40th anniversary, and I think while many in our audience are at least aware of the game, in your words, Mike, what makes Call of Cthulhu the game that it is? And like what separates it from a game like D&D, or what separates it from other Mythos games like Arkham Horror or Delta Green?
In one sense, Call of Cthulhu is quite different to D&D and many other kind of traditional role-playing games, in that rather than your character effectively turning into a superhero by leveling up and starting fairly weak but getting to 10th level and being to slay mighty dragons with a single shake of their sword, Call of Cthulhu, you play I guess, kind of normal people. You play kind of average people in a mirror of the real world, whether that's in the modern day or the roaring 1920s or Victorian gaslight or whenever. But you are in a kind of a model of the real world. And so you're playing regular folk who are thrust into challenging, exciting, and scary situations that they've got to kind of deal with. And with the presence of the Cthulhu mythos as a kind of the undercurrent running through the kind of setting, you're dealing with these kind of ancient alien horrors that humanity can't really comprehend and doesn't really understand. And the more kind of contact and the more you learn about this Cthulhu mythos, the kind of weaker you become. It's kind of the reverse of that kind of power fantasy kind of game, where your character actually, while you can improve your skills and get better at doing certain things, overall, you kind of have this downward spiral as a character, which is a kind of a mirror to, the horror trope. In a horror film, people survive, maybe they don't, but it's this kind of downward spiral that kind of really kind of cements what the game is about. And the other thing that kind of, I guess really set it apart when it first came out, and it's probably a little less so now, but Call of Cthulhu is very much a story-based game. It's very much about a plot and having events happen that the characters interact with and obviously build their own story and their version of the plot. But it is very story-based. It really is about telling these fantastic stories and kind of enjoying them as you do. Whereas, many other games aren't really about a story in that way. They are about upping the power of your character as your main motivator, or, piling through a set of rooms or a dungeon or whatever and, stealing treasure and whatever. Well, that's a story, but it's the same story you kind of tell every time. Whereas Call of Cthulhu, every story is different. Every scenario has got a different plot and different characters and the NPCs, really interact with the story in that way. Things happen, even if the investigators don't progress things, the rest of the world carries on, and they find themselves, lagging behind, and finding the bad guys are continuing with their plan, even if the investigators sort of stand idly by. So they have to kind of engage, otherwise, the bad guys win the day, effectively. Finally, the third part of my answer would be in terms of other kind of mythos games. Well, Call of Cthulhu was the first one. Call of Cthulhu was the one that really kind of was the first role-playing game that was really, at its heart, a horror mystery game. And, and to be quite frank, is the template and the basis for every other game that purports to use the Cthulhu mythos in some way, has been in part inspired by or a reaction to Call of Cthulhu. This is the kind of, the granddaddy of it all, the grandfather. Is the one that, is predominantly the most well-known, most played. And it's one of the most flexible still, because it allows you to play pretty much in any kind of time or setting that you want to do, whether it's, as I say, modern day or 1920s or the Dark Ages or science fiction or end times or the 1950s. Whatever kind of period of human history, Call of Cthulhu is easily adaptable to and works very well in, because at the end of the day, horror stories and the kind of collective narrative sharing of a tale, happens throughout human history, and Call of Cthulhu again mirrors that kind of device, really. So yeah, I mean, there's many things I can say, but I think they're the broad strokes of what makes Call of Cthulhu a very strong yet flexible, play experience.
TTRPGs have been enjoying a bit of a renaissance here over the past few years. What kind of impact have you seen on Call of Cthulhu?
We brought out 7th edition, I guess, I would say, at the cusp of this kind of new golden age for tabletop role play, and certainly it played its part in kind of, as I mentioned before, rejuvenating the game, bringing it to a wider audience, and kind of reinvigorating an old rule set with some more modern sensibilities in terms of representation of the rules and how you use them. But on top of that, in the years, in the 8 years since 7th edition came out, we've seen a kind of resurgence of role playing through through various things, such as online games. Playing online has opened the possibilities of people being able to access a game a little bit more easily than maybe before. Getting a group of people around the table can be a challenging thing sometimes, especially as people get older and have more family commitments and so forth. But being able to kind of pop online and do a 2 or 3 hour session online with friends anywhere in the world makes it very flexible and easy to do. So I think that's a really important factor. And plus we have things like YouTube and the whole kind of live play experience that people can now kind of engage with other groups and watch people like Critical Role and so forth, and Penny Arcade and all these other kind of well-known groups, and playing a variety of role-playing games, not just D&D, and people get to sort of vicariously experience that and kind of then maybe kind of think to themselves, hey, this looks quite good fun. It's quite good fun to watch it, but it may be even more fun to actually do it as well. And so I think that's been a good instigator of getting people to kind of find out about role play, get to see it, and get to kind of get a feel for whether it's the kind of thing they might enjoy, and then give it a go themselves. And that's they're two kind of new things, I guess, in a sense, that really help to again, reinvigorate the whole kind of tabletop play market in that sense.
So, as a part of the 40th anniversary, talking about new players, Call of Cthulhu, you guys had re-released the starter set from, I think it was almost 4 years ago at this point, which is a product I had always recommended to people just getting into the game. And I think one of the big reasons for that is the first booklet, Alone Against the Flames, which is a single-player scenario written sort of in the stylings of a choose-your-own-adventure story. I think apart from being a great way to teach the game mechanics, Mike, was there any other reason for its inclusion in the starter set? Did you feel like there was something, some sort of je ne sais quoi about it that you felt really captured the essence of what Call of Cthulhu is?
Yeah, I mean, Alone Against the Flames was a solo scenario written by a good friend called Gavin Inglis. And I think what he managed to do with that solo play was kind of capture the kind of spirit of the game very, very easily and quickly. And so by playing through it, you really get a sense of what the game is about. You get a sense that it's a mystery that you're trying to uncover. You get yourself into horrible situations very easily and find, your character kind of suffering or even dying, and you have to go back to the start and, try it again. And so it kind of captured that kind of essence of a horror mystery, that you immediately got the feel for. But importantly for me, with a starting set, I wanted a box set that not only introduced people to Call of Cthulhu if they've never played the game before. I wanted a box set that would introduce people to role playing if they've never done that before. And for me, the kind of classic of a tabletop role-playing game starter set is you take it home, you start to read it, and then you realize I've got to read all of this, and now I've got to cajole 3 or 5 of my friends to get together, and then I can run it, and it's kind of a it's not a big mountain to climb, but it is a mountain. It is a barrier to actually just getting into the game. So I literally wanted that, once you turn the first page of the first book, it says, right, pick up some dice and start playing. So you could literally, pick up the box set or get it delivered, and that night you can open it and you can actually play Call of Cthulhu on your own. And so you get that experience and kind of get a feel immediately for the game and, whether it's right for you or not. And then having played the solo, which gets you to roll up a character and teaches you how the basic kind of core mechanics of the game, rolling percentile dice and using skills and so forth. So by the end of that solo adventure, you've got pretty good grounding in playing Call of Cthulhu. And then, you're ready to go into the rest of the box set and actually start to introduce friends or family into playing it as a full-on role-playing game. But it was very important to me that you could do something with the box set as soon as you got it. I think it's one of those things you get all excited. You bought this new product and you get all excited and want to try it. And then you kind of realize, I've got to read all these 3 books and I've got to, learn these rules. And then I've got to get friends together. And then, I can't be bothered. I wanted to make it as easy and as accessible as possible. And I think Alone Against the Flames, that solo choose your own adventure style, scenario, was a great way to just, get people to be able to understand and enjoy a game immediately, basically.
I think you did a really good job in that regard. I actually played the game with my wife, who's never played role-playing games. So much like you were saying, like your target audience is not only somebody who may not have played Call of Cthulhu before, but may never have played role-playing games before. And she found it very intuitive, and I think that really speaks to the design of the starter set. But when I've talked to people outside of the Call of Cthulhu sphere, I feel like the game garnered a bit of a reputation for being a very brutal game where investigators either die or they go insane left and right. But I think 7th edition does a lot to combat this issue, and I think one of the ways it does this is by going through older scenarios like Paper Chase that's featured in the starter set and sort of reworking or retooling some of those encounters and, maybe tweaking the numbers a bit. But I'm curious, Mike, what are some of the aspects of older scenarios that you sort of focus your efforts on when updating them for 7th edition?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, what you've got to remember, it's a 40-year-old game and you're dealing with scenarios that are 40 to 30 years old, some of them. And you've got to, if you're me, then you can remember at the time what it was like when they first came out. Maybe if you're younger than I, you obviously that's going to be more of a problem to understand why games were written that way. But back in the day, games were very much an emulation of, what was then and still today is the kind of the market leader with D&D, and very combat orientated. Role play obviously grew out of wargaming, and so early role playing, it was very combat intensive. And when you combine that with a horror game, and if you keep in mind, like a horror film, like a zombie film or something, people are dying left and right in a horror film. And so that was kind of part of the ideology behind the original kind of version of Call of Cthulhu, is that it's a horror game where people are going to die, and that's cool. However, even at the time, I struggled with that kind of ethos in that, if all the characters die, we stop playing the game, because they're all dead, unless we kind of shoehorn some new characters in, at the drop of a hat, we've kind of ended the game because all the characters have just been eaten by a Shoggoth. And there wasn't really, in a lot of old scenarios, a lot of kind of alternatives to combat. A monster would be there, and pretty much it was deemed that you would fight the monster, or maybe you would run away. And that was the kind of the two alternatives to most encounters: run away or get eaten. And so Call of Cthulhu, not unfairly, kind of, people would kind of, say that, everyone just goes dead, or, everyone dies all the time. You can't really get into the game. And so when you kind of retool all the scenarios, what you're looking to do is kind of build in a range of options. So it isn't, so if the players do decide they want to go and fight the Shoggoth or the strange alien monster, they do so understanding that, there is a potential and a high risk of character death here if they really engage in that way, if they're unprepared perhaps. But equally, you're trying to present other options. Are there other ways they can deal with this thing? Could they just sneak around it, and get use it as an obstacle rather than a death challenge? And looking at kind of ways you can build in alternative routes through the scenario effectively. So different groups do different things, and you try and build in a range of options to facilitate differences in play in terms of each group. And so that's a lot about it. And as you say, there's a little bit about looking at how some of the mechanics work in a particular interaction, and maybe balancing that a little bit more, or at least giving players more forewarning that if they go through the cellar door, there's something horrible down there. So give them the choice. Do they want to go through the cellar door? So those kind of things you kind of take into account and kind of build in with a more kind of modern sensibility. Times have changed. Role playing has changed. Role playing, as I say, has been around over 40 years now, and so games evolve and play evolves as well. And so 7th edition is an evolution of the game and how role playing is nowadays in that sense, and that I want people to enjoy the scenarios and find some sort of satisfactory ending. And that doesn't necessarily mean they survive it. It could mean you can play Call of Cthulhu and have a very satisfactory ending for your character by your character dying, if the death is meaningful in the context of the story that you're creating. It's what people find frustrating, I think, about some of the early kind of role play material, particularly in Call of Cthulhu, as we're talking about it, is character death happening for no good reason, and that's just ultimately kind of frustrating. You invest in your character, you want them to do well, but as long as their actions and the consequences of those actions have some context and meaning within the game and within the story, then that's far more satisfying. It's generally unsatisfying if your character just dies because of one bad dice roll, or because the way the scenario designed is that if you fall, you fail your climb roll as you climb across this ravine or whatever, you drop and your character is instantly dead. Well, that's no fun, is it? I mean, and there's plenty of things in role playing you can do to mitigate that and give the character more chances to escape certain death, and make it a risky enterprise. But by just having the character die because of one bad dice roll, at the end of the day, is generally pretty frustrating. So that's the kind of thing we look to kind of redevelop and change up. Really, there's a lot of that kind of one roll death kind of mechanic in a lot of early scenarios that we just kind of remove that now, or put in a range of alternatives and to kind of make it a little bit more flexible, really.
You mentioned that 7th edition has brought back some old players of the game, and I started playing back in 1989 and have played off and on since. What can sort of a player like myself, who may have picked up an earlier edition of Call of Cthulhu, expect if they were to pick up the re-release starter set?
I mean, ultimately, I would, hand on heart, say the starter set isn't necessarily a product for you. However, if you've not really come across the new version of the rules, then that would be a reason to do so, because obviously it will guide you into some of the changes and evolution of the rules that come through in the current edition, 7th edition. In terms of the kind of the tweaks and things like that, we're looking at, again, kind of building a little bit more player agency into the actual mechanics. Also kind of trying to remove some of the more gnarly bits of the old rules. For instance, in older editions of Call of Cthulhu, one of the mechanics was called grappling, and it was literally non-lethal combat. I still have never yet found anyone who could tell me what the grappling rules are, that makes sense. That everyone's got their own version of the grappling rules, as in they've house ruled it to make it kind of work, because the original rules didn't really gel and didn't really weren't really clear in terms of how you use them. And so we kind of re-looked at that whole thing in 7th edition and actually kind of translated that into what we call combat maneuvers, which just work much more simply and work in line with everything else in combat in terms of the same kind of roles you're making and the skills you're using. And we just made it a lot clearer and easier to use effectively. And a lot of 7th edition is about streamlining the rules, making things a little quicker and making them easier and hopefully more intuitive, and ironing out some of the rougher edges from the earlier editions of the game. But as I say, things like optional rules like luck spending, where you can utilize your luck stat to actually adjust skill rolls and so forth, which again just kind of is a way to get around those issues where you may fail a roll by 1 or 2 points, and it's kind of like, well, what do I do now? Well, if you could just spend a couple of luck points and pass the roll, but it's your choice to do so. There's also things like pushing the roll, where you may fail a roll, but you really want to try and succeed. So you're allowed to have a second and final attempt at that skill roll. And in game, what that means is you are putting a more concerted effort into trying to achieve your goal, which is the outcome of the skill roll, and that just means you are putting more on the line. And in a horror game, that kind of makes sense in that if you put more on the line, the consequences of failure are actually worse than if you just tried and failed. It's like, as I say, it's like trying to open a door that's locked, and you try and break the door down, but you fail on the first attempt. Okay, so now you have a choice. Do you really want to push the door down? Do you really want to throw your entire body weight and take a running jump at the door to knock it down? Yeah, okay, well, that would be a push roll. But, it's clear that, if you're doing that, if it fails, something bad's going to happen. Maybe you make so much noise, you alert some, villain or monster that's going to come looking for you, or maybe you hurt yourself by throwing yourself at this door that's, far more stronger than you originally thought, or any other kind of consequence that may be in the context of the story. And so again, it kind of builds into that horror trope of, the more you do, the more you put on the line, the more you have to risk. And so it mirrors that kind of horror kind of sensibility, in that things can get worse, even if you succeed sometimes.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I actually think that this starter set does have some things that veteran players may want. And I think keenly in book 3, there's a bunch of really nice scenarios that are either good for one-shots or you've written them in such a way that they can sort of be played as an episodic campaign, which I really love the idea of. Not every campaign needs to be Masks of Nyarlathotep. What aspect of the starter set do you think you're most proud of, Mike?
It's difficult. I mean, I am kind of proud of the whole thing. I feel that it kind of achieves what I wanted to do. As I said, to introduce somebody to the game, and so by going through the books in the box and playing through the 4 scenarios in there, by the end of that, I feel that you would be a pretty accomplished keeper, able to then pick up anything really and give it a go in terms of the other kind of supplements and campaigns and scenarios for the game. I really just wanted to it's kind of like a GM kind of training camp in a sense, loosely termed. But I think you're quite right. There are as well as Alone Against the Flames, the three of the scenarios in there that start off, as a kind of a 1-on-1 or 1 and 2 player scenario, paper chase. They build on each other. And so, you can add more players, as you go through the scenarios till you've got effectively a full kind of play group playing through the scenarios. And, an experienced, Call of Cthulhu veteran in that sense, would, if they don't own the originals, they could certainly get some value out of picking up these newer versions of them, which again have been tailored to the latest edition of the rules. So they work straight off the page in that way.
Okay, Mike. So let's say I've purchased the starter set, I've played through Alone Against the Flames, and I've, glanced through the introductory rules, and I'm ready to run one of the scenarios for a couple of my friends. What advice would you give to me as a first-time keeper?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not to sweat it really. It's not to worry too much about it. I mean, the truism is you won't remember all the rules. Even though it's a cut down core mechanic kind of rule book in the book that gives you pretty much a full gaming experience for Call of Cthulhu. There are especially if you're newer to role playing, there's a lot of things to remember, and sometimes you're not going to remember them offhand straight away. So my advice is not to sweat it too much and just think about in a situation where you're a bit shaky on a particular rule, perhaps it's not to worry too much. You've got 2 options really. You can either kind of wing it and just what would be the logical thing to do in this situation? I'm just going to make a call and maybe call for a particular role or whatever it may be, and just find your way through it in a reasonable logical way. And the other option is to say, hey, let's just take a break, let's get a drink or whatever, and in that break just open the little book 2, which is the core rules, and just refresh your memory, and then you're good to go really. I mean, it's really it's about the play experience at the end of the day. The rules are there to help you. They're not meant to be a straitjacket and constraint that you have to get them all exactly right first time. It's a learning process for both the keeper and the players, and everyone's learning together effectively. So it's okay to kind of take a break and check something, or just roll with it. And as long as everyone's feels happy to kind of and comfortable with the situation, then just roll through it. And at the end of the day, the core mechanic, most people are going to remember that pretty easily. You make a D100 roll, and you need to roll equal to or under the skill level that particular character has. You can get by with just knowing that pretty much pretty easily. And anything else, you can look up maybe during game or after game. Just look up after the game. Just recheck what you did against some of the rules and just check: did I get that right? Did I get it? Did I have that set? And if not, you learn from the experience. So next time, you're up to speed. But ultimately, enjoy. It's a game at the end of the day, and it's a game that we want to enjoy playing with our friends. And so that's really the key. That's the most important. Whether you got the rules right or wrong is completely secondary to that. It's about, did you have a great time playing this game? If you did, then great. Everything else will follow. The more you do, the more experienced you become, the more stuff will just stick in your head, and you'll be ready to take on, that challenge again.
And in 3 years, you'll have finally read through Masks, and you'll start reading through Masks, and it will all spiral down from there.
Well, hopefully not. I mean, we did a lot of work in the new edition of Masks of Nyarlathotep to make it an easier kind of campaign to run, although it's admittedly a very large campaign with a lot of moving parts. we tried to add in a lot of additional guidance and a lot more kind of internal navigation into that campaign to make the keeper's job a lot easier than maybe what it had been previously. Less kind of having to improvise or think on their feet. So, tried to make it a little bit more of a more welcoming and user-friendly kind of version of the campaign. But admittedly, it's not something I would recommend anyone, reasonably new to the game to kind of head straight into. There's plenty of other kind of scenarios and smaller campaigns to kind of really kind of get under your belt and feel confident and ready to take on something bigger like Masks in good time.
I am personally now at that time myself. I've been, I think, keeping for about 5 years now.
Yeah.
And I'm just finally running my first Mask campaign next week, so that feels very much like an honor and a rite of passage as a Call of Cthulhu keeper. But Mike, let's say I'm a new player and I've run the scenarios in the box and I'm hooked and I want more. Where do I start? Do I start obviously with getting the keeper rule book so I get the rest of the rules, but where do I go from there?
Well, I mean, you have got a couple of choices really. You could, as you say, the logical option for many people would pick up the Call of Cthulhu Keeper rulebook, which is effectively the core book for the game. All the rules for the game are in that book, and it comes with loads of additional material in terms of lots of monsters and spells and advice on running the game, and two full scenarios in there as well. So that's enough. Many people do for the next step. However, because you've got effectively although it's slightly cut down, it is effectively the full rules of the game in the starter set. You could just actually pick up one of our scenario collections and get some more kind of experience with running scenarios under your belt before you start to introduce the full rules of the game. And there's a couple of books that I point people towards. One is called Gateways to Terror, which is three short scenarios. Each of them can be played in a single evening with 2 to 6 people plus the keeper GM. And they are written specifically for newer players, newer keepers. They're not heavily complex. Most of them only take place in a single location, so it's much easier to kind of get a handle on what's happening and where it is. And those are great, beginning scenarios in that way. And equally, there's a book that we do called Doors to Darkness, which has got 5 scenarios. And again, they are specifically written for newer players and newer keepers who are just starting out. And again, they're full on scenario adventures, but they're not overly complex. They're pretty straightforward, and they come with lots of additional guidance on how to do them, options for the keeper, and some advice on when they get to certain points in the game, what could happen here, what they might do, what the players might do, and so forth. And also, that book actually includes an initial essay just on some more advice about how to run Call of Cthulhu, that builds on the material in the core rule book, and so you get that kind of extra kind of value and benefit in that book as well. So those two are a really good places to start, as you say, the full keeper rule book.
I know that one of Nate's favorite things are the source books and setting material that is available for Call of Cthulhu, and I feel the same way. I love digging into some of those source books that you've created, whether it's for the Dark Ages or the Roaring Twenties or the Weird West. What have been some of your favorite settings to work on?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed working on Down Darker Trails, which is as you just mentioned, the kind of the Wild West kind of version of Call of Cthulhu, set in the late 1800s out in the American West. And so it's dealing with very kind of classic, not only kind of classic kind of Western tropes, but also, horror tropes as well, and combining them together and doing that kind of spooky, haunted West kind of, setting. And that was a lot of fun to do. And the other one that was particularly enjoyable was the 1920s source book on Berlin, which is called Berlin, the Wicked City. And in that kind of 1920s era, kind of, between, the Great War and the Second World War and the rise of Hitler and so forth, you've got this kind of period in German history, which is the Weimar Republic, where it's this kind of really hedonistic city with lots of arts going on and science and a real kind of aspirational kind of setting. But you've got this dark cloud hanging over it. That's because you're heading into this one of the worst times in human history is just around the corner, and so that kind of shadow presents a really interesting kind of dynamic in that setting. And as you say, one of the joys of a lot of the supplements and setting books of Call of Cthulhu is not only the kind of the game material, but the history material. I'm always, as I'm researching or writing or editing these books, I'm reasonably well versed in history. I've done a lot in and so forth at college and so on. But I'm still learning things as I edit or research things myself about different aspects of a particular era, be it the Dark Ages or the 1920s or whatever. You pick up these little tidbits that actually are really great scenario hooks, really. That's a really cool idea. That would make a really cool scenario. So let's put it in and hope it inspires somebody else in the same way. And but also that all that kind of material also helps to inform not only the keeper in terms of how they bring each of the settings to life in a real tangible, touch, taste, and feel kind of way. They also help to inform the players in terms of what people were like at that point, what they could do, what was the social conventions, and playing those social conventions is often a lot of fun. We're about to, in a short while, we'll be releasing a new kind of setting supplement book called Regency Cthulhu, set in the kind of the early 1800s, the film The Madness of King George, where the King of England was effectively insane. And so his son became the Prince Regent and ruled in that period. And England in that time, it's all kind of the England of Jane Austen, with very kind of particular style of etiquette and gentlemanly and lady behaviour and all that kind of thing. And it's a really interesting setting because you're dealing with this kind of all these social conventions, and yet there's this horror down in the cellar you've got to deal with. And how do you do that while you're still trying to obey the laws of society as well? So it kind of places kind of these moral dilemmas on players in terms of should their character do this or that, and what would the consequences be for either, and what's the best way through it. And that's one of the kind of joys of Call of Cthulhu is it's because you're playing relatively normal people but dealing with these difficult situations. They sometimes have to make these kind of moral choices, these kind of do we rob Peter to pay Paul? If we do that, is that the best outcome for us and them? Or do I sacrifice myself to save many people? Or is one better than many? And all these kind of questions often come up in Call of Cthulhu games where you're set these kind of challenges where there is no right or wrong answer. There's only the lesser of two evils often, and it's finding your way through that in a way that kind of makes sense for you as a player in your group can often be very enjoyable and challenging and memorable as well, as a play experience.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts about Call of Cthulhu, especially as a keeper. There's so much historical material out there that you can take just about any event from history and just give it a slight mythos twist, and all of a sudden you have a scenario on your hands. And not only do you have a scenario, but usually you have enough background information to really sort of build it out from there quite easily. And I think the source books do a fantastic job of helping keepers in that way.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. It's nice to get that kind of feedback to hear that they're kind of doing their job in that way. But you're absolutely right. You can pick up a copy of the Fortean Times or look on some sort of website that collects kind of spooky and strange happenings and pretty much build a scenario, as you say, out of that. And the other thing is, don't feel constrained to tweaking it to the Cthulhu mythos. In the core rule book, there's a whole section of monsters which we call traditional horror. So if you want to play with ghosts and vampires and zombies and werewolves and have nothing to do with the Cthulhu mythos and just kind of play it like a Hammer horror film in that sense, you can do that. The game works equally well with that kind of those kind of horrors. You don't have to have Cthulhu in the game if you don't want to. And so you can play, play quite traditional kind of horror stories with the game as well. It just comes down to what floats your boat, really, in terms of what are you looking for from the game and that play experience as a group of people.
Yeah, I feel like Paper Chase particularly is a scenario that if you didn't tell me that was a ghoul, I might suspect that that's a werewolf or something like that. Like that's a scenario that could easily be devoid of any mythos and still function as a Call of Cthulhu scenario, like you said. Going back to the source setting books, I just love how those books make the game almost feel like sort of another game entirely in a way, like you were mentioning earlier with Regency Cthulhu, is these sort of different social expectations that you can really play up in those games really do make them feel like different games entirely, which is really cool.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, playing characters out in the West, playing an old West school teacher and the sheriff's deputy is, it's going to feel different to playing the librarian and the taxi driver in the 1920s or even in the modern day. You play I know maybe you're a bunch of computer programmers in the modern day, and then it's ultimately your occupations as characters kind of help to inform that kind of feel and experience you have, and so they can feel quite different. There is one book that kind of makes things really different, and that's Pulp Cthulhu, which is a supplement that kind of, you've got a set of rules in Pulp Cthulhu that just kind of bolt into the main rules pretty easily, but it allows you to kind of play kind of larger than life characters. If you feel that you wanted your characters to have even more agency in the game and not be quite so frail and weak, Pulp Cthulhu allows you to kind of play in that in a pulp vein. So it's kind of like Indiana Jones versus Cthulhu. You're playing these characters that have double the number of hit points, and they have a little bit more kind of agency in terms of the skills they have, and they are able to kind of use their luck in a number of ways to even to kind of fend off certain death in certain cases, or to make sure their gun doesn't jam when they roll a fumble, or all that kind of thing. They just allow even more kind of player agency for groups that kind of want to play Cthulhu but don't want to play the kind of the more darker, gritty kind of standard version of Call of Cthulhu. There's a kind of a slightly more, where the fun is a little bit more increased in terms of that kind of like slightly gung-ho crazy kind of pulp style. Pulp Cthulhu does that, and again with the pulp rules you can apply them to any scenario that we do, and most of our games will have some sort of advice on, if you're going to use this with Pulp Cthulhu, here's what you might do to change things up for that kind of style of game. So we try and present the game in a as you say, in a variety of kind of modes, to really, for each group to find the size and fit that's right for them, because every group's different and every group is looking for a slightly different experience at different times, and so trying to present a wide range of flexibility just means hopefully you can find the shape that's right for you for a particular game that you want to run.
And speaking of games to run, there's also plenty of campaigns as well. I think we have almost half a dozen at this point, and at least for 7th edition, and then there's numerous more for previous editions.
Oh yeah.
If I remember correctly, you released, or rather re-released, Beyond the Mountains of Madness in its original form last year. Is that correct, Mike?
That's right. Yeah, it's one of those campaigns we've not been able to really get around to doing a full kind of update into the new edition. But one of the beauties of Call of Cthulhu is that even though we're talking about the latest edition, 7th edition, and there are some rules changes, they're actually really minor. You can actually just pick up an older edition scenario or campaign and run it with 7th edition. In fact, at the back of the rule book, and you can actually download these for free on Drive-Thru RPG, are the conversion guide, which is only a handful of pages, and it's really very simple things that you just change on the fly. You don't have to do a lot of preparation. So we were able to put out Beyond the Mountains of Madness, which is a kind of a classic kind of campaign where the characters all go off to Antarctica and find ancient mysteries in the ice, and be able to kind of play that either with an old edition if you're a long time player, or just convert it on the fly to use with the current edition of the game. But yeah, Call of Cthulhu is one of those games that there's kind of two modes of play, and sometimes perhaps we don't make this clear enough. Is that there's a campaign style of play where you are playing a story over a length of time, over a series of interconnected scenarios, even partly or fully interconnected, and so you're playing with the same characters and developing them and seeing where they end up, and that's that allows you to get a very immersive, long-term kind of fun experience. But equally, Call of Cthulhu, like we talked about some of the scenarios in the starter set, is a great game for one-shots as well. You can play treat a one-shot like a horror film or a horror story, with a beginning, middle, and an end, and your characters only are only in the game for that one scenario. So all bets are off. They could die like in a horror film, or crazy things could happen, and the whole world could blow up at the end of it. Because it's a self-contained story. So it works very well in convention play for that kind of thing. And if you're just having a one session, one night kind of game, the kind of scenarios I mentioned from Doors to Darkness or Gateways to Terror, or the ones in the start set, can really easily accommodate that kind of style of play too. So it just comes down to, does everyone, want to get into this in a deep way and play a long campaign and tell this grand kind of epic story? Or does everyone just want to get together and, raise some hell and play a one shot where the fate of the world is at stake? Then, yeah, you can do that as well. So that's one of the things that I've always loved about Call of Cthulhu, is you can play it in very different ways.
I think one thing I particularly have been enjoying with some of the newer releases that you've been doing over at Chaosium is I really like the more open-ended source books, quote unquote, like Malus Monstrum and more recently Cults of Cthulhu, that sort of give tools to the keeper to be able to either flesh out their own scenarios or their own campaigns based on certain aspects of the mythos. Mike, what was some of the things that you wanted to tackle in Cults of Cthulhu?
Call of Cthulhu, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all storytellers. Most role players are storytellers, especially if they become the GM in some kind. We've all got stories we want to tell. Humans, since the dawn of time, have told stories, and we love it. We love telling stories, and we love hearing stories. And so books like Cults of Cthulhu and Malleus Monstrum are really books of inspiration to help you tell your story, or the story that you want to create. And so Cults of Cthulhu, the main kind of dynamic for wanting to do this book is the game's called Call of Cthulhu. Yet Cthulhu as an entity, as this kind of classic monster, this alien god, has rarely actually featured in the game. It's been like everyone but Cthulhu in most of the scenarios and campaigns and source material. And when we were coming up to the 40th anniversary, I just thought, well, wouldn't it be kind of cool if we finally did a book that was just about Cthulhu, and so we could finally kind of get to grips with Cthulhu, using Cthulhu in our games. And so that was really where the Cults of Cthulhu book came from, which is a source book which describes the kind of the nature of why humans kind of turn to these kind of alien godlike beings and worship them and become in the game terms cultists and evil people, effectively doing bad things to kind of for various personal agendas and so forth, and how the Cthulhu mythos as a whole kind of corrupts and changes them. We wanted a kind of book to help you kind of design your own cult. In the book, it contains various examples, and some you can just pull straight from the book and use as written. But there's also a lot of guidance on terms of how to create your own cult, and who leads it, what are their motivations, who are the rank and file members, and what's their overall mission, what are they trying to achieve. And that allows you to obviously build that and then use that as the basis to then tell stories in game, and to tell and design mysteries. It also comes with 3 pretty large scenarios, one set in Victorian London, one set in LA during the 1920s, and one set on the east coast of the US in the modern day. So again, to try and be very flexible and show you could use these anywhere. And although it is about Cthulhu and the Cthulhu cult in general, the principles and the kind of mechanics on designing your cult, you can actually just apply to any of the kind of the mythos horrors. If you wanted to use a different kind of alien god rather than Cthulhu, and maybe it's Hastur or the King in Yellow or Sothogura, the same principles apply. You just change the name, and you can still come up with a cult that's appropriate to that kind of alien monster. So we wanted to make it, a versatile, interactive kind of thing, for people to use and to inspire them to tell their own stories with.
So Call of Cthulhu has celebrated 40 years recently, and looking forward, we had mentioned Regency Cthulhu earlier in the episode, which is a setting that I am very excited for as someone who grew up with a lot of Jane Austen in the air. Mike, I'm curious, what are some other products or releases that players and keepers can look forward to?
Sure. Well, as you said, we only just released Call of Cthulhu in print book form. We also just released a new campaign, which is particularly geared at more kind of less experienced keepers, called A Time to Harvest, which isn't as it isn't as big as Masks. It's not got as many moving parts, and it's a lot simpler to run. So it's a great campaign for people who are just starting out with the game to kind of get a grip on campaign play. So those two have just come out. And as I say, Regency Cthulhu is, will be coming along, in the near future. But currently, I'm working on an update and a new edition of Cthulhu by Gaslight, which is the Victorian era Call of Cthulhu. So, late 1800s, the time of Jack the Ripper and the London fog and all of that. And so we have a new edition of Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu by Gaslight, in the works at the moment. And it's actually going to be a slight change of format to how it's originally been produced. Originally, it was one book that kind of was really just for keepers. It kind of had the kind of character generation and scenarios for that kind of setting. But we wanted something that players could actually really get hold of and use and make their own. So we've actually created two books for Gaslight. There's a player-facing book and a keeper-facing book. And the player book has character generation, lots of setting material about, what is Victorian London, what's the Victorian era like, what things would be useful for them to know, lots about, different aspects of the Victorian setting for players to kind of be able to kind of digest and take on and use in the game, as well as a version of the core kind of rules are in that book as well. So I mean, even if you've not picked up the starter set or the core rule book of Call of Cthulhu, you can pick up the Gaslight player book, and it's got the rules for you to start playing in there as well. So that's really cool. And the Keeper version, the Keeper Gaslight book, is all the secret stuff. It's all the all the complications a keeper can bring in their games, all the kind of different kind of characters and NPCs and scenarios are included as well, and what the mythos is doing during the Victorian age and so on. So those two books kind of together formed Gaslight. But again, if you're a keeper, you really only need to buy the one, and if you're a player, you only need to buy the one. So hopefully that makes it a little bit more flexible and versatile for people. And what's really cool is we've got a brand new or two brand new books coming to follow those kind of core Gaslight books. We've got a new campaign for Gaslight, which is called The Curse of Seven, which is informed by British horror writers of that time. So M.R. James and Arthur Machen and so forth. And there's a bunch of scenarios that kind of build together to kind of give this view of Victorian society and this dark kind of underside. And then we've also got a collection of scenarios that aren't a campaign. Obviously, you could string them together if you wanted to do that way, but they also work as one-shots. And again, they present the Victorian era in different ways with different themes and horrors. And what I like about Gaslight is because it links up with Down Darker Trails, the Wild West setting we were talking about, because they happen at the same time. So you can actually join them together and have people either start out as Down Darker Trails characters out in the West, and they, for some whatever reason, they travel across the country and end up in Victorian England or Europe, and you can kind of seamlessly join them together. Or the alternative, you start out in Victorian London and then end up on a boat to the East Coast and end up wandering around Victorian era New York or Boston, and then take a stagecoach and you end up in the Wild West. Kind of brings the other side of the coin to the whole kind of late 1800s era. So that excites me because that just creates something new and allows even more kind of even more kind of interesting kind of stories to be told and kind of adventures to be made.
I am very excited. I've been like giddy in my chair listening to all of this. I was not aware that you guys were working on a Gaslight. That's very exciting for me, as I've been running a pulp Down Darker Trails campaign for the past year now. So very excited for
that sounds great. Yeah. I mean, there's one I can tell you about one other book that's again getting into production now, that has all been written, and I've finished my editorial on it and finished writing it, to be honest. Is the a new edition of Arkham, which is Arkham is the fictional kind of town created by H.P. Lovecraft in his stories, where a lot of the kind of Cthulhu mythos stories take place in the fiction. And originally, Chaosium put out a book of Arkham in various iterations over the years, but it's been out of print for some time. And so this is a new kind of reimagining of Arkham. It builds on the previous editions, but adds in loads more kind of information for keepers, loads more kind of plot hooks and seeds, lots of NPCs and strange mythos goings on, and kind of maps out the entire town and becomes effectively a fantastic, pre-built sandbox for anyone to kind of use as a basis for a campaign for Call of Cthulhu. And obviously within Arkham you've got Miskatonic University, so whether you're playing people who live and work in Arkham, or whether you're playing students at Miskatonic University, and they all get hooked up into some kind of strange alien horrors and mysteries, that book caters for that kind of style of play as well.
Oh, I'm sure many of our listeners are going to be very excited about a Arkham source book. That's all very exciting news. So it sounds like there's a lot to be excited for in the future. But before we wrap up the episode, Mike, is there anything else that you would like to say or possibly shout out before we wrap things up today?
I mean, apart from thanks for chatting and having the opportunity to talk about the game and so forth, much appreciated. I think, I just go back to, what we talked about if you're just kind of thinking about giving this a try, the starter set is really your best first point of call, really. It really does kind of help to introduce you to the game and get a feel for it. And because it's a low price point, it's not a big investment to make. You can get the PDF very cheaply, or buy the print box set. And as I say, the whole point of the box set is not only to teach you the game so you can go on playing it, so to give you that relatively low cost barrier to just give the game a try and see whether it's the kind of game for you. Because at the end of the day, let's be fair, not everything suits everyone. And so you may find that you find Call of Cthulhu and you can enjoy it, but it's not really your thing. Or you pick it up and you give it a go and you find, actually, this is exactly the butter on my bread, and I love it and I want to give it, I want to do more. And the starter set is designed to kind of give you that taste, so you can make an informed decision about is this the game that's going to really work for you and your players, and it's a great place to start off. But as I say, don't sweat the rules. It's all about having fun. It's all about telling some cool stories that you all enjoy and develop together. And that's what's most important at the end of the day. Is it's coming away going, yeah, we had a great time doing it. Maybe we forgot half of the rules as we did it. That doesn't matter. As long as you came away and you had a good time, that's what we're talking about.
Well, thank you very much for coming onto the show, Mike. It's been a pleasure to have you on and discuss Call of Cthulhu. For any of those interested in purchasing the starter set, we will put links in the show notes of this episode, along with the free scenario, The Haunting, and the Quick Start rules that are also available on Chaosium's website. If for some reason the low entry of the starter set is not quite what you're looking for, well, The Haunting is also a very great scenario as well. Again, thank you to Mike for joining us on this episode. I've been your host, Nate, and with me today was...
I'm the man from Leng.
And we will see you all in the next episode.